Again, my name is Susan. Thank you so much for having me. I'm with the New York City Health Department, and this is going to work out well because I am focusing on evaluations of a few interventions that Brian and Andrew have not evaluated. There are very few things left for us to do, but those are the ones I'm going to focus on. So I'm going to quickly go through 5 to 6 interventions that we have done at the Health Department and what we've learned from them, and then what questions we still have left. So first is Shop Healthy Here, and Brian, you've referred to this in your talk as well. So Shop Healthy Here is a program that we have been implementing in the Bronx in specific zip codes and working with bodegas and small retail owners to increase the number of healthy options that they offer in their stores. Specifically, we're asking them to make 7 key changes, and you can see a list of the 7 changes here. They range from things like stocking 2 healthy snacks, stocking low sodium canned goods, placing water at eye level, and you'll see that the blue bar is what the stores were doing, or what percentage of the stores were doing these things already pre our intervention, which is around May of 2012, and what they were doing about a year later in May of 2013. And all of these different 7 criteria, you see that stores were able to implement them at a much higher rate. So this was great knowledge that we obtained. Even a year later, stores were able to sustain these changes. We weren't in these stores for about a year. But there were a few unanswered questions that remained after this. So although we are doing this and seeing that we're able to change the environment, what is the impact of these different things actually on consumer purchasing of healthy products? So just because we're placing water at eye level, how many more customers are actually purchasing water? If we're stocking more low sodium canned goods, how many customers are actually purchasing that now? So that's something we don't have the answer to just yet, but one of the studies that we're trying to do is actually do what we call a bodega bag check study. As people are leaving specific retailers, we're looking inside their bags to see what they purchase, so we can say, okay, the stores that kept the water at eye level, people walking out of there are more likely to have water in their bags when they leave. And we don't have the results yet, but that's in process. And then the other thing is actually getting a sense of where people commonly purchase their foods from in New York City. And Brian, you mentioned 90% are at supermarkets. I'd be really interested in seeing that data, because that's one of the things that we struggle with too. Where do people purchase, especially in New York City that has such a high density of retail outlets, restaurants, green carts, farmers markets, fast food, and all of these other food sources that we have here. Next intervention is the institutional food policies that we have put in place across city government. All of our agencies have to abide by our executive food standards that dictate what we can serve. So for example, these food standards cover not only city agencies, they cover all public hospitals. We've also been able to implement standards in our schools and daycare settings, and they cover various venues. So for example, all of the 3,000 vending machines on our city properties have to abide by our standards. Things served in cafeterias or at meetings and events, and meals served obviously also have to abide by these standards. So we know, looking at all of the different agencies that are covered of the meals served, this is the range of locations that are meeting our standards or have to meet our standards. And you can see that it's a really wide range, from correctional institutions to homeless shelters to schools to parks. And so we see that it's actually very feasible to do across a wide range of settings, reaching a pretty diverse audience. What we don't know is, again, going back to the first point on Shop Healthy, is how have some of these things actually impacted customer choice? So for example, if you take into account the vending machine standards, which require only 2 slots of the vending machine to have sugary drinks, and the rest have to be low-calorie options, how does that influence what a consumer purchases? And so here again is an area where you need actually sales data to get that sense, but that's actually very hard to obtain. Same thing here with the green carts. One of the initiatives talked about earlier was our Fresh initiative, and how the availability of a supermarket in these food desert areas impacts accessibility. So another initiative that we have is our Green Carts initiative, which are mobile food vendors that sell only fruits and vegetables. There's about 1,000 permits in the city, and there's about 500 of these carts in the streets in these food desert areas. And so one of the unanswered questions, and this has actually been answered and hopefully will be coming out soon, is how have these green carts affected fruit and vegetable consumption in these neighborhoods? And so there will be data coming out on that very soon through an EpiData brief that is currently going through review. And the news looks good. Second, this isn't a policy, but I think something that we spend a lot of our, certainly our time and energy in thinking about how to do well, and that is some of the media campaigns and the public education campaigns. Most of our campaigns recently have been focused on sugary drinks. We try to increase awareness that they are linked with harmful health effects, try to shift social norms and reduce consumption in large portion sizes. So this is an example of one of the campaigns that showed how many packets of sugar are in sugary drinks. And we did a recall, and about half of people that's recalled seeing these ads said that they were very likely to reduce sugary drink consumption. So we've increasingly been able to get data from online panels and online surveys where we show the ads and get a sense of how many people have seen these and then what their reaction to them has been. And if you look at our community health survey over the last 6 years or so, we've seen a decline in sugary drink consumption from about 36% to 28%. So we think our media campaigns had a lot to do with this trend, in addition to all of the other work going on in the city by many of the partners. But it still remains to be seen what are the main message themes and channels that are most effective for selling healthy foods and unselling unhealthy foods. A lot of our knowledge in this area has come from our experience with tobacco ads and tobacco media campaigns, and we've really seen through that work that hard-hitting graphic images of the health effects are very powerful, and we've been using some of those same techniques. But that learning process in tobacco, every time there's a new focus group, we're learning something new, and I think that same science is still yet to be perfected in the food environment. And that's something, again, we're learning with each iteration, and we're trying to do online panel surveys after each campaign to understand the reach and impact. The National Salt Reduction Initiative is an initiative that we are partnering with food industry to set targets on sodium in packaged goods and asking industry to meet these targets. So we set 2012 and 2014 targets for very specific food categories, and we had over 20 companies meet the targets for 2012. So we saw very specific progress by companies in very specific areas. But one of the big questions that we'd like to get a better sense of is really how much sodium is sold through the food supply and has it decreased over time. And this is a very complicated question to answer because not only do you have to look at sodium in the products themselves, you also have to look at how much of that product is being sold. So for example, you can either reformulate the product to have lower sodium if companies are doing that, or simply maybe consumers are being more aware and they're purchasing higher amounts of the low sodium foods and lower amounts of the high sodium food, but the product itself is not changing. Both of those things can impact the amount of sodium that is actually moving out the door and into our food supply. And so getting a better sense of what is actually going on there. And we hope to answer that question using a packaged foods database that we've constructed using some of the data that we've gotten back from NSRI. The trans fat policy, which was implemented in 2006, prohibited the use of trans fat by all food service establishments. A specific policy study looking at receipts in the same way that Brian had mentioned earlier for the calorie study assessed impact pre and post using the receipt purchases and linking that to nutritional information that was found on the websites of these restaurants. And overall, trans fat purchases went down by about 2.4 grams. The purchase the total purchase that was made in these restaurants, the total purchase trans fat amount decreased by 2.4 grams. So we saw a positive benefit there. Portion cap policy applies to, or would have applied to restaurant food carts concessions. It's still undergoing appeal. We think hopefully in the next few months we'll be learning a little bit more about what the courts will be saying around that. And although it hasn't been implemented, I want to also mention, not only did Brian talk about his modeling exercise, looking at what the impact of that policy would be, there was also another paper by Claire Wang looking at what the potential impact would be that showed a 50 to 60 calorie reduction per day. And I mentioned this last piece, which goes into my concluding thoughts, because one is just realizing and keeping in mind as we think about the future and what we can achieve, that sometimes for the answers we don't know, things like modeling can help us answer those questions, and that is a tool I think is not utilized as often, and I think journals and funders don't really tend to put emphasis on those types of research studies, but I think they're equally important. I actually had a sub-bullet on here that I removed around randomization and the use of controlled trials, which is hard to do in a real-world setting always. So although I wish we could do that, I think a lot of times, the politics of what is possible, what is not, and putting resources in certain areas is a little bit tougher. And so a lot of our policies are citywide, but looking at other creative mechanisms to implement those, whether it be through, looking at trends over time, comparing pre-post, or using, for example, other political jurisdictions like outside of New York City versus New York City to evaluate some of the impact, can be creative ways to get around that. Access to sales data, I think, is very important. For many of the things that, for example, food industry does and how they've been able to hone in their marketing and messages, they have a very readily available metric, which is their sales data. And we in public health don't always have that, so we need to look at creative mechanisms, whether it's creating a bodega in your hospital and then using that to evaluate sales or purchasing sales data, thinking about how we can do that better to link our built environment changes to actual consumer behavior, I think, is an area that we need to think about a little bit more. And then lastly, social norms and public opinion data. I think that is very important for policymakers in thinking about which policies are palatable. With anything that you do, there is always a very vocal minority in opposition. And if you think about the example Andrew mentioned around letter grading, everybody loves letter grading. But if you look at the vocal minority in opposition, which is probably businesses that don't do as well in that system, it seems like nobody likes it. But if you get a sense of public opinion, you'll see overwhelming support. And that's really important to show your policy leaders, not only the impact data, but also the opinion data about how people feel about these policies. So with that, I will close up and turn it over to Jacqueline.